Covering up a prominent surgeon's fatal mistake seemed entirely too easy to the smirking hospital board. They were perfectly willing to destroy a quiet nurse's life to save their own skin, and the police even had the handcuffs ready. But the hunters instantly became the hunted the moment federal agents breached the boardroom doors, proving the board had vastly underestimated their chosen scapegoat. The rhythmic, piercing beep of the heart monitor was the only sound keeping the chaotic energy of Trauma Bay anchored to reality. It was 2:15 a.m. at Chicago's St. Jude Medical Center, the kind of hour where the veil between life and death wears perilously thin. Alice Beckett stood quietly in the corner, her hands resting in the pockets of her standard-issue blue scrubs. To the rest of the staff, Alice was just a reliable 32-year-old float pool nurse. She was the one who never complained about double shifts, never engaged in the vicious nurses' station gossip, and blended into the sterile white walls of the hospital. She was invisible. And for the last 3 years, that was exactly how she wanted it. But tonight, invisibility was a luxury she couldn't afford. On the operating table lay Senator David Caldwell, a heavy-hitting politician with a penchant for keeping his health crises out of the media. He had been smuggled through the loading dock an hour earlier, complaining of severe tearing abdominal pain. The man officially in charge of keeping the senator breathing was Dr. Harrison Reed, the hospital's chief of surgery. Dr. Reed was a man whose ego entered the room a full minute before he did. Dressed in a pristine surgical gown, his face was already glistening with a nervous sheen of sweat. He had misdiagnosed the senator's pain as a severe but manageable gallbladder attack. Alice, however, had spent a decade reading the silent universal languages of human trauma. Looking at the senator's pale, diaphoretic skin and the specific way his blood pressure was slowly but inexorably trending downward, Alice knew this wasn't a gallbladder issue. It was an abdominal aortic aneurysm, and it was leaking. "Dr. Reed," Alice said, her voice low and remarkably steady. "His systolic is dropping. Heart rate is 130 and climbing. If we don't open him up and clamp the aorta, he's going to code." Reed snapped his head, up his eyes, flashing with insulted fury. "Nurse Beckett, I do not need a diagnosis from someone whose primary job is emptying bedpans. The ultrasound showed inflammation. Push 20 milligrams of labetalol and prep him for a standard laparoscopic cholecystectomy. Pushing beta blockers will crash his compensatory mechanisms," Alice warned, not moving an inch toward the medication cart. "He's bleeding out internally." "Do it, or I will have you fired before your shift ends," Reed bellowed, his voice cracking slightly. Before Alice could refuse again, the high-pitched, continuous drone of the monitor cut through the room. The senator's eyes rolled back. His body seized violently, then went entirely limp. The monitor displayed a chaotic scribble before flatlining. "Code blue." Panic erupted. The junior residents froze. "Doctor," Reed stared at the monitor, his hands trembling violently. The man who was supposed to be the best surgeon in Chicago had completely locked up. "No, no, no," Reed muttered, stepping back from the table. "This isn't happening. Get the defib. Defibrillators don't fix hypovolemic shock," Alice said. In a fraction of a second, the quiet, unassuming float nurse vanished. What replaced her was something cold, precise, and utterly terrifying to watch. Alice moved with a mechanical, blinding speed that defied explanation. She didn't wait for orders. She didn't shout for help. She shoved Dr. Reed out of the way with enough force to send him stumbling into a tray of instruments. "What are you doing?" Reed screamed. "Security, get her away from the patient." Alice ignored him. She grabbed a scalpel and a heavy-duty central line kit. She wasn't prepping for a standard chest compression. There was no time for a surgical team to scrub in and open the chest, and standard CPR on an empty vascular system was useless. She needed to stop the internal bleeding instantly. Without hesitation, she sliced a perfect, clean incision into the senator's femoral artery at the groin. "She's mutilating him. Stop her!" Reed yelled, paralyzed by shock, watching as this ordinary nurse performed a highly invasive, incredibly complex surgical maneuver. Alice wasn't listening. Her mind had seamlessly transported back to the dusty, blood-soaked floor of a Black Hawk helicopter over the Kunar province. Using a rigid wire and a balloon catheter she had snagged from a nearby cart, she threaded the line up the senator's femoral artery, feeding it blindly, but with devastating accuracy, straight up into his descending aorta. It was an improvised Reboa resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta. It was a cutting-edge military battlefield technique used by elite special operations medics to stop massive internal bleeding. It was absolutely, unequivocally not something a civilian nurse was licensed, trained, or legally permitted to do. She inflated the balloon, essentially tying off the blood flow to the lower half of the senator's body, preserving what little blood he had left for his brain and heart. "Start massive transfusion protocol, uncross-matched O-negative now," Alice barked. The sheer authority in her voice broke the residents out of their stupor. They scrambled to obey. Within 30 seconds, the flat line on the monitor gave a weak, erratic blip. Then another. The rhythm stabilized. The blood pressure started to climb. Alice had literally snatched one of the most powerful men in the state back from the absolute brink of death. The room fell into a stunned, deafening silence, save for the rhythmic beeping of the newly restored heartbeat. "Doctor," Reed pushed himself off the wall, his face pale, his eyes darting between the stabilized patient and the nurse holding the bloody catheter line. He didn't see a hero. He saw the end of his career. He saw a multi-million-dollar malpractice lawsuit. He saw a nurse who had just exposed him as a fraud in front of his entire staff. "You," Reed whispered, pointing a shaking gloved finger at Alice. "You are completely insane. You performed an unauthorized, unscrubbed surgical intervention. You assaulted this patient." Alice calmly locked the catheter in place, her heart rate never having spiked above 80 beats per minute. She stripped off her bloody gloves, tossing them into the biohazard bin with a wet slap. "I kept him alive, Dr. Reed," Alice said quietly. "Now I suggest you scrub in and fix the ruptured aneurysm I just bought you time to repair. You have about 45 minutes before tissue necrosis sets in." Without another word, Alice turned and walked out of the trauma bay, leaving the chief of surgery trembling in her wake. She knew what was coming next. The hospital bureaucracy was a machine, and the machine always protected its highest earners. But Alice had survived far worse monsters than arrogant surgeons. The summons came at 9 a.m. sharp. Alice had spent the remainder of her shift sitting quietly in the break room, sipping bitter hours-old coffee. She hadn't bothered to change out of her scrubs. When the head nurse tapped on the glass and told her the hospital administration wanted to see her immediately, Alice simply nodded, picked up her badge, and walked toward the executive wing. The boardroom at St. Jude Medical Center was designed to intimidate. It was a cavernous space, paneled in dark mahogany, dominated by a massive glass table that reflected the Chicago skyline. When Alice entered the heavy oak doors clicking shut behind her, she found herself facing a tribunal. At the head of the table sat Evelyn Croft, the chief hospital administrator. Croft was a woman whose entire existence was dedicated to profit margins, risk management, and public relations. To her right sat Dr. Harrison Reed, looking remarkably composed, his earlier panic replaced by a smug, venomous confidence. To Croft's left sat two uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department, looking uncomfortable but alert. "Have a seat, Ms. Beckett," Croft said, her voice dripping with bureaucratic frost. She didn't look up from the thick legal pad in front of her. Alice pulled out a chair and sat. She kept her posture relaxed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She made eye contact with the police officers, giving them a polite brief nod before locking eyes with Dr. Reed. He looked away first. "Ms. Beckett, we have spent the last 6 hours untangling the absolute disaster you caused in Trauma Bay for last night." Croft began, finally looking up. "Senator Caldwell is currently in stable condition in the ICU. However, his survival is a miracle, considering the malicious and grossly negligent assault you perpetrated against him." Alice didn't blink. "Assault." "Let's not play coy," Dr. Reed interjected, leaning forward. "You panicked. When the senator experienced a minor hypotensive episode, you completely lost your grip on reality. You shoved an attending physician, grabbed surgical equipment, and mutilated a United States senator without authorization, anesthesia, or a basic understanding of anatomy. You nearly killed him." Alice let the silence hang in the room for a moment. She looked at Reed, her expression devoid of anger, which seemed to unnerve him even more. "A minor hypotensive episode," Alice repeated softly. "He coded. His aorta ruptured because you misdiagnosed him with cholecystitis. The telemetry logs will show his pressure bottomed out. The surgical notes will show a massive abdominal bleed. I applied an improvised reboa to preserve cerebral perfusion." "Nurses do not perform reboas," Reed shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "It's a highly specialized vascular procedure. You shoved a dirty wire into his femoral artery. It's practicing medicine without a license. It's aggravated assault." Evelyn Croft held up a hand, silencing the surgeon. She slid a thick, freshly printed document across the glass table toward Alice, along with a sleek silver pen. "Here is how this is going to go, Ms. Beckett," Croft said smoothly. "We are currently facing a potential scandal that could ruin this hospital. You are going to sign this document. It is a full admission of guilt, stating that you suffered a psychiatric break due to work fatigue, went rogue, and interfered with Dr. Reed's life-saving efforts. It also includes an ironclad non-disclosure agreement." "And if I sign it?" Alice asked, not touching the paper. "If you sign it, your employment is terminated immediately, and we report you to the nursing board to have your license revoked permanently," Croft replied coldly. "But in exchange for your cooperation in keeping this quiet, St. Jude will not press criminal charges. You get to walk out of here and quietly disappear. And if I don't sign—" Croft sighed a theatrical display of disappointment. She gestured to the 2 police officers. "Then Dr. Reed files a formal complaint for physical assault. The hospital files charges for reckless endangerment and practicing medicine without a license. Officers Jenkins and Miller here will arrest you right now. You will be perp-walked out of the lobby in handcuffs, and the senator's legal team will bury you under civil suits for the rest of your natural life." The room was suffocatingly quiet. Reed leaned back in his chair, a triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He had won. The scapegoat was secured. His career was safe. "Sign the paper, Alice," Reed mocked gently. "It's over." Alice looked down at the confession. She looked at the silver pen. Then she slowly looked up at Evelyn Croft. "Ms. Croft," Alice said, her voice entirely devoid of fear, "do you know why I was able to perform an endovascular balloon occlusion in under 60 seconds in the dark with improvised equipment?" Croft narrowed her eyes. "I don't care about your delusions of grandeur, Miss Beckett. I ask," Alice continued, ignoring the interruption, "because before you try to blackmail someone, you should really do a deeper background check. My nursing degree from the University of Michigan is real, but if you had looked closely at my employment gap between 2014 and 2022, you might have noticed a few anomalies." "Enough of this," Reed snapped. "Officers, arrest her." Officer Jenkins, a seasoned cop who had been quietly observing Alice's entirely unnatural calm, unclipped his handcuffs and stood up. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to stand up and place your hands behind your back." Alice didn't move. She glanced at the heavy clock ticking on the boardroom wall. 9:14 a.m. "I wouldn't do that, officer," Alice said politely. "You don't have the jurisdiction." Reed let out a harsh laugh. "You're a nurse, Alice. You aren't a diplomat. Grab her." Officer Jenkins stepped forward, reaching for Alice's arm. Before his fingers could even brush the fabric of her scrubs, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom didn't just open, they violently swung outward, slamming against the walls with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. The two local cops instantly dropped their hands to their holsters, spinning around. Dr. Reed jumped out of his chair, and Evelyn Croft let out a startled gasp. Marching into the room was a man in a sharply tailored charcoal suit, his face carved from granite, holding up a gold shield. Behind him poured 4 tactical agents wearing Kevlar vests, stamped with large yellow letters FBI. But it wasn't just the bureau. Flanking the agents were 2 towering men in full military dress uniforms, the insignia of the Department of Defense gleaming on their lapels. "Everyone freeze hands off the weapons, step back from the table," barked the man in the charcoal suit. His voice echoed off the glass walls with absolute, unquestionable authority. Officer Jenkins and his partner immediately raised their hands, stepping away from Alice. The man in the suit walked directly to the head of the table, his eyes locked onto the hospital administrator. He didn't even glance at Alice, who remained comfortably seated, a faint, knowing shadow of a smile finally touching her lips. "I am Special Agent Thomas Briggs, Federal Bureau of Investigation, working in conjunction with the Department of Defense," he announced, slapping a thick-sealed manila folder onto the glass table, right on top of Alice's forced confession. Evelyn Croft was pale, her perfectly manicured hands trembling. "Will, what is the meaning of this? You can't just storm into a private hospital boardroom. We are in the middle of a delicate HR matter." "Your HR matter is officially a matter of national security." "Ms. Croft," Agent Briggs said, his tone icy. He turned his gaze to Dr. Harrison Reed, whose triumphant smirk had completely evaporated, replaced by wide-eyed terror. "Doctor, road bell soft tat stop bro." Briggs continued taking a pair of federal handcuffs from his belt and tossing them onto the table with a heavy metallic clatter. "You're about to have a very, very bad day." The metallic clatter of the federal handcuffs, sliding across the glass table, echoed through the boardroom like a judge's gavel. For a long, agonizing moment, no one breathed. Dr. Harrison Reed stared at the steel cuffs, his meticulously maintained composure finally cracking. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like one of the cadavers he usually operated on. "Is this a joke?" Reed stammered, looking from the handcuffs to the imposing federal agent. "I am the chief of surgery. I am the victim here. That woman," he pointed a trembling finger at Alice, "assaulted a United States senator and bypassed every medical protocol in this hospital. If you're here for an arrest, you should be putting those cuffs on her." Special Agent Briggs didn't flinch. He slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket, resting his hands on his hips. "We aren't here for Nurse Beckett, Dr. Reed. We are here to dismantle a coordinated assassination plot. A plot you were the anchor for." Evelyn Croft gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Assassination Agent Briggs, you cannot be serious. Senator Caldwell suffered a spontaneous abdominal aortic aneurysm. It was a tragic medical emergency. It was a targeted, chemically induced vascular rupture." A deep voice boomed. One of the military men stepped forward from the doorway. He was tall, heavily decorated, and carried an aura of absolute command. The name tape on his immaculate army dress uniform read Jace. He walked past the local police officers, past the trembling hospital administrator, and stopped directly in front of Alice. Colonel Gregory Jace of the United States Army Special Operations Command looked down at the quiet nurse in the faded blue scrubs. His stern features softened into a look of profound, unwavering respect. "It is damn good to see you again, Captain Beckett," Colonel Jace said softly. He brought his hand up in a crisp, razor-sharp salute. The two FBI tactical agents flanking the door immediately snapped to attention, their posture rigid. Alice slowly stood up from her chair. She didn't look like a terrified nurse facing termination anymore. The slump in her shoulders vanished. Her spine straightened, her chin lifted, and the quiet, invisible hospital employee disappeared completely. She returned the salute with the practiced, effortless precision of a seasoned combat veteran. "Good to see you too, Colonel," Alice replied, her voice steady. "Though I wish the circumstances were better." "Captain," Evelyn Croft whispered, her voice cracking. Her eyes darted wildly between Alice and the military officer. "What is going on here?" "Her personnel file says she's a civilian float nurse. She's been emptying catheters on the 4th floor for 3 years. Agent Briggs flipped open the thick manila folder he had slammed onto the table earlier. It was heavily stamped with red, capitalized letters, "Top Secret/SCI Eyes Only." "Your HR department ran a standard civilian background check, Ms. Croft," Briggs said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Which is exactly what we wanted you to see. What you didn't see is that Alice Beckett is a former captain in the United States Army. Specifically, she was the lead trauma resuscitation specialist for an elite off-book Tier 1 surgical team attached to the Joint Special Operations Command." Briggs began pulling glossy redacted documents from the folder, tossing them onto the glass table for the board to see. "She has done multiple classified tours in Syria, Afghanistan, and Yemen." Briggs continued mercilessly. "She has been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross and 2 Silver Stars for performing complex life-saving surgeries under heavy enemy fire. To put it simply, Ms. Croft Captain Beckett has forgotten more about trauma medicine than Dr. Reed will learn in 3 lifetimes." Reed gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "This is impossible. If she's some elite military surgeon, why is she wiping down beds in a Chicago hospital?" "Because 3 years ago, after her last team was caught in an IED blast in Kandahar, Captain Beckett requested to be quietly discharged." Colonel Jace intervened, his eyes narrowing at Reed. "She wanted peace. She wanted off the grid. So the Department of Defense created a watertight civilian cover for her. She earned her nursing degree legitimately, and she wanted to do simple, honest work, saving everyday people. Until 48 hours ago, Briggs smoothly took over. When federal wiretaps intercepted chatter that a defense contractor under investigation by Senator Caldwell was going to use the senator's upcoming Chicago visit to permanently silence him. The air in the room grew thick, suffocatingly tense. Alice watched Reed closely. The surgeon was beginning to hyperventilate. "We knew they had someone on the inside of St. Jude," Briggs said, pacing slowly around the table toward Reed. "We just didn't know who. So Colonel Jace reached out to his retired ghost. We activated Captain Beckett and quietly manipulated the hospital's scheduling matrix to ensure she was in Trauma Bay 4 when the senator arrived. The gallbladder misdiagnosis wasn't incompetence, Dr. Reed." Alice spoke up, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "It was intentional. The senator was injected with a slow-acting, microscopic, necrotic agent, likely a synthetic derivative of a hemorrhagic venom designed to weaken the walls of his aorta. It mimics the symptoms of a gallbladder attack until the blood pressure spikes and the artery violently tears. Alice leaned forward, planting her hands on the glass table, staring directly into Reed's terrified eyes. "You knew he was bleeding out internally," Alice said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "You ordered beta blockers because you knew they would crash his remaining compensatory mechanisms and trigger a fatal cardiac arrest. You were trying to stall the surgery just long enough for him to bleed to death on the table, allowing you to call it a tragic complication. But you didn't count on a floor nurse knowing how to deploy a battlefield reboa." "Lies!" Reed screamed, his voice pitching into a hysterical squeak. He stumbled backward, knocking his heavy leather chair to the floor. "This is a setup. You have no proof I am a respected surgeon. You are a paranoid psychopath." Agent Briggs didn't even raise his voice. He simply reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small encrypted digital recorder. He pressed play. The audio was slightly staticky, but the voices were unmistakable. "I don't care how you do it. Just make sure he doesn't wake up from the anesthesia. 4 million will be wired to the Cayman account the second the death certificate is signed." The second voice on the tape let out a nervous, breathless sigh. It was Dr. Harrison Reed. "Just make sure the wire clears. I'll blame it on a ruptured aneurysm. I'm the chief of surgery. No one will question my autopsy report." Click. Briggs stopped the recording. "That wiretap was captured at 11:45 p.m. last night, Dr. Reed. 10 minutes before the senator was wheeled through your loading dock." The silence that followed was absolute. The two local police officers, Jenkins and Miller, had backed away entirely, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the federal tidal wave crashing down on the room. Evelyn Croft looked physically ill. The polished, untouchable hospital administrator realized in a fraction of a second that her prestigious medical center was about to become the epicenter of the biggest federal murder-for-hire scandal of the decade. "Agent Briggs!" Croft stammered, her voice shaking violently. She desperately tried to pivot, looking at Alice with pleading eyes. "Captain Beckett." "Alice!" "We had no idea. The hospital administration was entirely in the dark. We are victims of Dr. Reed's deception just as much as the senator." Alice picked up the forced confession Croft had tried to make her sign just 10 minutes earlier. She held the paper up, letting it catch the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "You didn't care about the truth, miss Croft," Alice said evenly. "You cared about your public relations. You were perfectly willing to destroy an innocent nurse's life to protect your profit margins. You didn't investigate. You just needed a scapegoat." Alice tore the confession precisely in half, then in half, again letting the pieces flutter down onto the pristine glass table. "You're under federal audit now," Briggs informed Croft coldly. "The FBI will be seizing all of Street. Jude's financial records, internal communications, and medical logs for the past 5 years. If we find out you so much as suspected Reed's offshore accounts, you'll be sharing a cell block with him." Briggs nodded to his tactical agents. "Cuff him." The two heavily armed agents moved with terrifying speed. Before Reed could even process the command, he was slammed face first onto the mahogany paneling of the wall. The federal handcuffs, the exact ones he had mocked Alice with, clicked tightly around his wrists. "You can't do this." Reed sobbed, his arrogance completely shattered as he was dragged toward the heavy oak doors. "I have rights. I want my lawyer. You'll have plenty of time to consult your lawyer at the ADX Florence Supermax facility," Briggs replied. He watched as the disgraced surgeon was hauled out of the boardroom, a pathetic, whimpering mess. The threat was neutralized. The room breathed a collective, shaky sigh. Colonel Jace turned back to Alice. "The senator's security detail has been entirely replaced by DOD personnel. He is heavily guarded in the ICU and is expected to make a full recovery thanks to you. Your mission is complete, Captain." Alice nodded slowly. She reached up to her scrub top, unclipping her plastic St. Jude Medical Center ID badge. She looked at the cheap, smiling photo of herself, the invisible float nurse who only wanted a quiet life. She placed the badge gently on the table next to the shredded pieces of the NDA. "What happens now, Alice?" Croft asked, weakly looking at the badge. Are you coming back to work?" Alice looked at the hospital administrator, her eyes devoid of any anger or malice, only profound pity. "No, Evelyn," Alice said softly. "I think my shift is finally over." Alice turned away from the table. She didn't look back at the extravagant boardroom, the terrified executives, or the remnants of her civilian cover. She walked out the door, falling perfectly into step beside Colonel Jace and Special Agent Briggs. As they marched down the sterile white corridors of the hospital, the staff parted like the Red Sea, watching in stunned silence as the quietest nurse in the hospital left under the protection of the United States military. Alice Beckett stepped out through the automatic glass doors of the lobby and into the crisp, unforgiving Chicago morning. The sun was just beginning to break through the clouds. She took a deep breath of the city air. Her cover was blown, her quiet life was over, and the shadows of her past had finally caught up with her. But as she climbed into the back of the waiting black-armored SUV, a small, genuine smile finally crossed her face. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't have to hide who she was. The ghost of JSOC was awake, and she had work to do. What an insane turn of events. Alice proved that true heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear faded blue scrubs and carry top-secret security clearances. If this incredible story of justice, medical brilliance, and a massive federal takedown kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life drama.